You wake up in a smoky hut, your feet already dusty, and someone's yelling at you. Congratulations, you're now a teenager in a Zulu village. Forget everything you've seen in movies about epic warrior battles and noble savages. Your biggest concern right now isn't wielding a spear. It's avoiding stepping in cow dung while carrying water from the river. Again, for the third time today. The reality of pre-colonial Zulu life had very little to do with dramatic warfare and everything to do with the mundane art of staying alive, fed, and relatively clean in a world where privacy didn't exist. You're coughing before you're fully conscious. That's not a cold, that's your bedroom ventilation system working exactly as designed. The smoke from last night's cooking fire still hangs thick in the air, mixing with the fresh smoke from your aunt's morning fire next door. Your eyes water and your throat burns. But this is just Tuesday morning in your dome-shaped hut, a traditional beehive-style dwelling called an unglamorous. The wattle and door walls keep out rain, wind, and unwanted visitors, but huts were built with small openings and a central hearth, so smoke lingered by design rather than as an accident. Modern comforts? Not today. Practical survival choices? Definitely. Your hut sits in the middle ring of a carefully planned circle called the umuzi. The outer edge bristles with a thorny hedge that could shred an intruder's legs before they made it halfway through. Your family's huts form the next ring inward, each positioned according to a social hierarchy you learned before you could walk. At the center lies the cattle fold, where the family's real wealth sleeps under the stars. This isn't random village planning. Every structure, every gap, every thorny branch serves a purpose that becomes obvious the moment something goes wrong. The smoke burning your eyes serves multiple purposes that become clear when you understand the trade-offs. It preserves food, repels insects, and provides warmth, even if it makes you cough every morning. Your ancestors chose practical benefits over comfort, and honestly, they made the right call. The same design logic explains why you're sleeping on a reed mat that pokes through your thin blanket and directly into your spine. Comfort ranks somewhere below survival, security, and not freezing to death. Your sleeping place signals your rank in the household. Placement of huts, sleeping spots, and duties is meaningful, learned from childhood. You're not sleeping by the door because you're important, but because the arrangement reflects the family's protective priorities. Your reed sleeping mat, woven from plants that grew by the river, costs nothing to replace and positions you where the household structure demands. The urgent voices calling your name from outside confirm what you already suspected. Someone needs something, and teenage you is the obvious choice to provide it. Adults don't fetch water or chase escaped goats. That's what teenagers are for. The voices carry that special tone reserved for tasks that need doing immediately, but that nobody with any status wants to handle personally. What feels like chaos when you're lying there with smoke-filled lungs and a back full of reed punctures is actually a precisely organized domestic machine. Every uncomfortable detail serves a survival purpose that's been tested across generations. The hard sleeping surface that makes your joints ache also prevents you from oversleeping when work needs doing. The strategic placement that puts you closest to potential danger also protects the people who know how to keep everyone alive. Your burning eyes and aching back aren't design flaws. They're the price of admission to a system that's kept families fed, sheltered, and breathing for centuries without requiring a single nail, screw, or building permit. The Zulu figured out how to create security using nothing but thorns, mud, and strategic thinking that would impress a military engineer. But before you can appreciate this architectural genius, someone's shouting your name and pointing toward the center of the homestead, where the morning's first challenge awaits. The cattle fold spreads before you like a minefield of fresh obstacles. 37 cows have been busy while you slept, and they've left evidence of their productivity scattered across every square foot of ground between you and them. Your bare feet and the urgent need to reach the cattle create a strategic puzzle that requires careful navigation. This isn't just where livestock gets stored. The central cattle fold holds your family's entire economic future. Animals that represent bride wealth, or ilo bolo, and social status all rolled into 4 legs and an udder. That spotted cow near the gate? She's worth enough to secure a marriage alliance. The big bull eyeing you suspiciously? He's your grandfather's retirement plan. Lose one to disease or theft, and your family's social standing drops along with their bank balance. The household is organized so the most valuable assets are in the most protected place, an arrangement that shapes where people sleep and who responds first to danger. Cattle sleep in the center, while humans sleep in the outer ring, because protection priorities follow economic logic. The kraal uses thorn hedges and stockades to create defensive barriers, with the cattle fold positioned at the center where raiders would face the most resistance. If attackers breach the thorny perimeter during the night, they'll have to get through the human defenders before reaching anything valuable. Your morning navigation challenge intensifies because the ground is soft from recent rain, which means fresh deposits create treacherous footing. You can't take your time picking a path because the cattle need to reach their grazing grounds before the day gets hot. But you can't rush, because slipping while trying to handle valuable livestock is the kind of mistake that gets discussed at family gatherings for decades. The morning ritual of letting cattle out to graze requires precise timing and coordination involving the entire extended family. Uncle counts heads while cousin checks for injuries, and you navigate the obstacle course with a stick to guide stragglers. Everyone has a role, and everyone knows exactly how much economic damage can result from a single mistake. The cattle need fresh grass, but they also need to return before dark. Cattle counting reveals everything about your family's wealth and your position in the village hierarchy. Wealthy families own dozens of head. Poor families own a few scrawny animals that barely qualify as cattle. Your family falls somewhere in the middle, which means you're important enough to have responsibilities but not important enough to avoid the messy ones. Successfully navigating the kraal without incident marks your first small victory in a day full of similar challenges. The cattle lumber toward their grazing grounds, your feet remain relatively clean, and nobody's shouting at you for economic sabotage. Yet. But now, that clay pot your aunt spent 3 days making is waiting, and the river isn't getting any closer. The clay pot balanced on your head represents hours of skilled craftsmanship that your aunt created with careful skill, pottery making being traditionally women's work and highly valued in the household. Drop it, and you're not just clumsy. You're economically destructive on a scale that affects the entire household's ability to collect, store, and prepare water for cooking. Water collection isn't just a chore. It's a social expedition where village gossip flows as freely as the river current. The walk to the water source becomes a traveling news network, where you learn which families are planning marriages, who's feuding with whom, and exactly how much cattle everyone actually owns versus how much they claim to own. The other women and girls making the same journey carry information more valuable than the water itself. Miss the river trip, and you miss the village's unofficial intelligence briefing. Your position in the family determines when you eat, what you eat, and whether you get the good porridge from the top of the pot, or the burnt-bottom scraps that taste like charcoal mixed with disappointment. The sorghum grain that forms your daily meals requires grinding by hand, managing cooking fires that produce more smoke than heat, and timing everything perfectly to avoid creating an inedible paste that nobody wants to swallow. The household porridge is sorghum, the same grains used for beer and for simple staples like uphuthu and amasi. This is repetitive subsistence food that keeps you alive but rarely makes you happy about it. The process starts before dawn with women grinding sorghum between stones, creating a powder fine enough to cook without turning into lumpy disappointment. The cooking fire needs constant attention because too much heat burns the bottom, while too little heat leaves raw grain floating in lukewarm water. Getting the consistency right requires experience that comes only from years of making the same porridge every single day, until you can judge doneness by sound, smell, and the exact way the wooden spoon moves through the mixture. Seating arrangements during meals reveal family power structures with surgical precision. The head of the family sits in the position of honor, while everyone else arranges themselves according to age, gender, and current family standing. Food distribution follows these same hierarchies. Adults eat first and best, while children get what remains. Meal etiquette operates under rules stricter than military protocol. Speaking out of turn earns public correction, and reaching for food incorrectly signals disrespect that can affect your family's reputation throughout the village. The act of eating together reinforces everyone's place in the social structure through a dozen small rules that govern everything from hand placement to eye contact to the proper way to acknowledge the meal's quality. Understanding meal politics teaches you more about village social structure than any formal lesson could provide. Every spoonful of porridge comes with a lesson in hierarchy, respect, and the complex web of relationships that keeps families functioning as economic and social units. With breakfast concluded, the day's real work begins. Your teenage status means you get the jobs nobody else wants. and your cousin is already approaching with that particular expression that means you're about to receive instructions you won't enjoy following. Your cousin hands you a task that roughly translates to, go do the thing that everyone hates doing and do it perfectly. The smile on her face suggests she's genuinely pleased to pass this particular responsibility down the age hierarchy to someone who can't refuse. Village life operates on a complex system where women handle domestic labor, men manage cattle, and teenagers carry much of the routine grunt work. You're old enough to handle dangerous or disgusting tasks, but too young to have any say in what gets assigned to you. Every adult feels entitled to give you orders, but none of them want to do the actual work themselves. Your uncle needs firewood collected from the forest, but his back suddenly hurts when the topic comes up. Your aunt needs grain ground into flour, but she remembers urgent business elsewhere the moment the grinding stones appear. The system works beautifully for everyone except the teenagers who actually have to perform the labor that keeps the village functioning. Some tasks carry more prestige than others. 0. 5. Herding is higher status because it handles the family's wealth, while grinding and other repetitive chores are less so. Older systems also organized young men into age sets and regiments, a reminder that teen roles could carry social as well as economic meaning. But regardless of status, someone needs to complete every job, and that someone is usually you. Your performance is constantly observed and evaluated by multiple generations of relatives who have nothing better to do than critique your technique. Grandmother watches from the shade while offering helpful suggestions about your posture. The surveillance never stops, and everyone's an expert on work they're not doing themselves. Public shame hurts worse than physical punishment because it affects your family's reputation throughout the village, while reduced food portions provide immediate feedback about completing tasks correctly. The physical demands of daily work shape your body, whether you want them to or not. Hauling water jars builds shoulder strength. Walking long distances to collect wood develops endurance. Lifting grain baskets creates muscle definition that comes from actual labor rather than recreational exercise. The work happens in all weather conditions because crops don't care about your comfort level, and cattle need attention whether it's raining or scorching. Work assignments prepare you for adult responsibilities while keeping you firmly in your current place within the family structure. Learning to manage cattle teaches economic responsibility. Grain preparation develops domestic skills. Even the most unpleasant maintenance tasks provide lessons in sanitation and community health. Every terrible job comes with practical knowledge you'll need when you're running your own household and assigning tasks to the next generation of teenagers. The relentless supervision isn't cruelty disguised as education. It's how communal oversight transmits skills and cultural norms from experienced adults to inexperienced young people through direct participation rather than theoretical instruction. The village can't afford to let teenagers learn through trial and error when mistakes affect everyone's survival. As the day progresses, you notice older teens wearing specific bead patterns that seem to carry messages more complex than anything related to work assignments. Those patterns carry meaning that requires careful interpretation. Beadwork signaled age, marital status, courtship intentions, and sometimes regional identity, but many villagers know the common patterns, while meanings shift by region and context. That girl wearing blue and white beads just walked past, and 3 different adults suddenly got very interested in your reaction. Your aunt stops grinding grain to watch your face. Your uncle pauses mid-conversation to see if you'll look back. Even grandmother lifts her head from her weaving to observe this teenage moment with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. They're not being nosy. They're reading a complex social situation that you're still learning to navigate. Beadwork isn't decoration. It's a sophisticated communication system, broadcasting messages about availability, intentions, and social status through colors, patterns, and arrangements that carry specific meanings. Those blue and white beads might signal that she's interested in courtship, or that her family has particular wealth, or that she comes from a specific region where blue means something entirely different than it does here. The quality of the glass and exactly how the beads are arranged on her clothing add layers of meaning that experienced readers can decode instantly. You're expected to read these coded messages correctly, but nobody explicitly taught you the system. Adults assume you'll pick up bead communication through observation and social osmosis, the same way you learn to avoid stepping in cow dung and when to speak during meals. The problem is that misreading bead signals carries consequences that affect more than just your personal embarrassment. Get it wrong, and you're not just socially awkward. you're potentially damaging family reputations and alliance possibilities. Regional variations in bead color meanings create additional complexity that can trip up even experienced readers. Green might symbolize jealousy in your village but represent grass and prosperity in the next valley over. Red could signal passion here, but indicate danger somewhere else. The same bead pattern might announce availability for courtship or warn that someone is already spoken for, depending on local customs that shift across the landscape. Bead gifts function as courtship letters written in glass and thread. Giving the wrong color combination sends messages you didn't intend to send, while choosing poor quality beads insults the recipient and their entire family. The economic aspect reveals itself through quality and quantity that directly reflects family wealth and trading connections. Glass beads acquired through trade with European traders could cost more than most families earn in months, making extensive beadwork a display of surplus wealth spent on items that serve no practical function beyond social communication. The social minefield of teenage interactions grows more treacherous when you realize that bead communication operates under rules that adults understand but rarely explain. One wrong move damages not just your reputation but your family's standing throughout the village and beyond. Parents watch teenage bead interactions with the intensity of diplomatic negotiations because that's essentially what they are. Today she wore blue and white. Is that an invitation, an inheritance, or an old family signal? You only know by watching. But as shadows lengthen across the homestead, the day's social calculations take on different weight entirely. The sun is setting, and suddenly everyone's behavior shifts. The ancestors have clocked in for their evening shift, and their watchful presence shaped daily behavior and ritual obligations. That argument you had with your sister over grain portions? Recorded. The way you dragged your feet during cattle herding? Noted. Your attitude during water collection? Filed under teenage problems that need addressing. Evening brings the day's final accounting, where ancestral spirits evaluate your performance and family harmony with the thoroughness of tax auditors. Every mistake, every social misstep, every moment of laziness has been observed by the Amadlozi, the ancestral spirits who intervene in daily life. They can be thought to remember transgressions and require rites to restore harmony, and unlike living relatives, they never lose interest in your spiritual development. The evening meal seating position announces to everyone, living and dead, exactly how you performed today, with closer placement to the head of the family, reflecting better behavior and ancestral approval. Ancestor veneration operates on the principle that dead relatives make better supervisors than living ones. Your deceased grandfather watches your daily conduct through spiritual eyes that never blink or look away. These ancestral spirits, the Amadlozi, possess the power to bless your family with good fortune or curse you with problems that range from sick cattle to failed crops, to social embarrassment that lasts for generations. Ritual slaughter and offerings, often of cattle, provide a real mechanism for maintaining ancestral favor and restoring spiritual balance when things go wrong. Daily behavior connects directly to ancestral approval through a system that makes modern performance reviews look simple. Acting with Ubuntu, the complex concept involving respect, generosity, and community spirit, increases your spiritual credit score. Causing family disharmony or showing disrespect triggers spiritual consequences that affect everyone related to you. The ancestors function as intermediaries between your family and Unglamorous, the creator god who apparently delegated daily human management to deceased relatives. The transition from day's practical concerns to night's spiritual responsibilities highlights how the mundane and sacred interweave in Zulu life. Milking cows and avoiding cow dung transforms into spiritual education about your place in generations of family history. Every boring chore becomes a test of character that the ancestors evaluate for signs that you're developing into someone worth remembering. Evening rituals reinforce clan identity while preparing the family for night's vulnerabilities. Darkness brings spiritual dangers that require ancestral protection. The rituals create a framework that connects your family to protective spirits, while establishing your identity within the larger clan structure. Your isithunzi, the essence of your character and moral standing, gets shaped by these daily interactions with both living relatives and watching ancestors. The weight of ancestral expectations creates genuine pressure that makes teenage rebellion considerably more complex. Disappointing living adults is temporary embarrassment. Disappointing the dead affects your spiritual legacy and your descendants' future welfare. The consequences extend beyond personal shame into realm of family fortune and community standing. As you prepare for sleep, your smoky hut no longer feels like punishment. It feels like protection against spiritual dangers that emerge when darkness falls. The day's endless tasks and social navigation suddenly reveal themselves as something more deliberate than random hardship. This comprehensive education system worked because it embedded learning directly into survival activities. Your day of avoiding cow dung and navigating family politics was actually a masterclass in survival, social cooperation, and cultural transmission that kept communities thriving for centuries. The cattle that created your morning obstacle course represented bride wealth, or ilobolo, connecting daily chores to marriage alliances and economic stability. The ancestral spirits, or amadlozi, who observed your every move, transformed routine tasks into moral accounting that shaped character across generations. Every uncomfortable detail served a purpose that modern life solved differently. The smoke that burned your eyes also preserved food and repelled insects. The constant supervision that felt oppressive was comprehensive education, disguised as daily routine. The Zulu developed systems that transmitted knowledge, skills, and values through direct participation rather than classroom instruction, creating solutions that were remarkably efficient for their context. Next time you complain about your morning routine, remember that somewhere in history, a Zulu teenager was facing similar challenges with considerably higher stakes and much less privacy. If you enjoyed this quiet walk through history, feel free to like or subscribe, and maybe share a thought in the comments about your own morning struggles. Now rest easy knowing your ancestors figured out survival long before alarm clocks existed. You wake up in ancient Helike in the winter of 373 BC on what feels like any other festival night. The wine is flowing, your neighbor is complaining about his wife, and there's a gentle rumble beneath your feet that everyone dismisses as the gods having a particularly rowdy evening. You laugh it off too. After all, this is Greece. The ground shakes sometimes. What you don't know is that you're experiencing the opening act of one of history's most complete vanishing acts. By morning, your entire city will be submerged beneath the waters. Not destroyed, not conquered, swallowed by the earth and sea. The festival night that changed everything begins with something as ordinary as reaching for your wine amphora when the first tremor hits. Just a gentle shake that makes the wine slosh against the clay walls. The liquid moves in slow circles, creating tiny waves that catch the early sunlight streaming through your window. Outside, the festival of Poseidon Heliconios is already in full swing. Pilgrims crowd the sanctuary steps, their voices mixing with the calls of merchants hawking olives and bronze trinkets. The smell of roasted goat drifts through the air, mingling with the less pleasant aroma of unwashed festival goers who've been celebrating for 3 days straight. Your neighbor Alexios stumbles past your doorway, his wine-stained chiton hanging loose around his shoulders. He's muttering something about Poseidon having too much to drink again, and laughs at his own joke before nearly tripping over a sleeping dog. Everyone chuckles because earthquakes are just part of life here in the Peloponnese. The ground shakes, you steady yourself, and life goes on. Some cities have parades. Yours has continental drift, but this tremor feels different. Instead of the usual quick jolt that rattles your teeth and moves on, this is a slow, rolling motion that makes your stomach turn. The movement seems to come from deep underground, rising through the earth like a giant taking a deep breath. Your oil lamp swings gently on its bronze hook, casting moving shadows across the wall. You set down the amphora and pause, trying to identify what feels wrong. Then you remember the animals. 5 days ago, every rat, snake, and stray dog fled the city in what seemed like organized panic, a detail recorded by ancient writers, and one modern geologist's note as possible seismic precursors. The streets became eerily quiet without their usual scurrying and barking. You dismissed it as coincidence, but your horse refused to enter the stable that same day, rolling his eyes white and backing away from the stone building like it was on fire. What you don't know is that your city sits directly on one of the most seismically active fault systems in the Mediterranean. The Gulf of Corinth is a tectonically active rift that has slowly pulled apart over centuries, building strain along faults beneath your feet. Those animals that fled weren't being dramatic. They were detecting P-waves, the faster-moving seismic vibrations that arrive minutes before the destructive waves that topple buildings and split the ground open. That gentle tremor you're feeling isn't Poseidon's hangover. It's the fault line beneath Helike beginning to rupture after centuries of building tension. You step outside, where other citizens are emerging from their homes with the same puzzled expression you're wearing. Someone points toward the sanctuary, where the bronze statue of Poseidon seems to be swaying slightly on its pedestal. You gather with your neighbors to discuss these strange tremors, unaware that the ground beneath your feet is about to betray you in ways you never imagined possible. The conversation shifts from puzzled murmurs to genuine alarm as the ground beneath your feet suddenly gives way. Geologists estimate the plane may have dropped on the order of meters in just seconds. One moment you're standing on solid stone pavement, the next you're looking up at Alexios from what feels like the bottom of a shallow pit. The weird part isn't the fall, it's that the ground didn't crack or break. It just sank like someone pulled a plug underneath the entire city block. Around the agora, merchants are setting up their morning stalls when the main earthquake hits. A potter drops an amphora that shatters against stones that are already shifting beneath his feet. Children playing with wooden hoops watch their toys roll downhill on streets that were perfectly level moments before. The earthquake doesn't announce itself with a dramatic roar. It starts as a deep vibration in your bones, then builds to a rolling motion that makes walking feel like trying to balance on a ship's deck during a storm. The fault rupture tears through the bedrock beneath Helike, causing massive chunks of earth to simply drop away. Entire city blocks sink as the ground splits and shifts along invisible lines of weakness. Your street tilts at an angle that makes no sense, creating an instant slope where there was none before. Houses that stood for generations suddenly find themselves several meters lower than their neighbors, creating a chaotic landscape of sudden cliffs and valleys. But the real terror begins when solid stone streets start behaving like thick soup. The pavement beneath your feet turns soft, then begins flowing like mud mixed with water. Heavy objects, stone blocks, bronze statues, loaded carts, dart, sinking into what was solid ground just minutes earlier. This isn't magic or divine punishment. The wet ground loses its strength and behaves like thick porridge. Everything built on it simply sinks. This process is called liquefaction, where seismic waves cause water-saturated soil to act like liquid instead of solid earth. Your house doesn't collapse in a pile of dramatic rubble. Instead, it slides apart piece by piece as its foundation turns to soup. The stone blocks, fitted together without mortar in typical Greek fashion, simply separate and sink into the liquefied ground beneath them. There's something almost polite about the way the walls drift apart, like dinner guests excusing themselves from an awkward conversation. The columns of Poseidon's sanctuary tilt and sink into the earth like ships going down in slow motion. These massive stone pillars, each weighing several tons, disappear inch by inch into what was solid ground moments before. The bronze statue of the god himself leans at an impossible angle, before vanishing completely into the liquefied soil. Ancient writers would later claim this statue remained partly visible in the water for generations, a bronze reminder of the city that once stood here. You're witnessing one of geology's most devastating phenomena, the transformation of an entire city's foundation from solid to liquid in a matter of minutes. But as you struggle to help your neighbors climb out of the liquefied ground, you don't yet realize that the earthquake has set something else in motion. Someone shouts a warning that makes your blood freeze. A wall of water is racing across the plain toward your sunken city. The voice cracks with panic, pointing toward what should be empty farmland but now shows a dark line moving fast across the horizon. This isn't rain or river flooding. This is something much worse. The earthquake created more than just ground failure. When the seafloor dropped in the Gulf of Corinth, it displaced massive amounts of water that had to go somewhere. That somewhere is racing toward you at the speed of a galloping horse. This isn't one of those tsunamis that starts in the deep ocean and travels thousands of miles. This is a local seismic sea wave generated by the sudden collapse of underwater terrain just a few kilometers away. Ancient sources place Helike roughly 2 kilometers from the Gulf. Modern researchers explain that fault movement and local subsidence turned the plain into a low basin and an instant lagoon, allowing seawater to rush in. The wave doesn't need to travel far, because your city has already dropped several meters below sea level. What used to be solid ground, elevated above the coastal plain, is now a perfect basin waiting to be filled. The earthquake essentially carved out a channel that leads the incoming water straight toward the ruins of your homes and temples. Ancient writers claimed 10 Spartan ships anchored in Helike's harbor were dragged down with the city. But here's the puzzle. How does a harbor 2 kilometers inland get hit by a tsunami? The answer lies in geography that changed in minutes. The earthquake created an instant lagoon where your city once stood, and the wave followed this new topography like water finding the bottom of a bowl. You watch in horror as the water carries away everything that survived the liquefaction. Houses that managed to stay somewhat intact during the ground failure now float apart like children's toys, while the bronze statue of Poseidon disappears completely as the water level rises above what used to be the sanctuary's roof. People who escape the sinking ground find themselves swept away by currents that have no business existing this far from the sea. The water brings more than just destruction. It brings proof. Mixed in with the mud and debris are tiny sea creatures, marine organisms that will remain embedded in the destruction layers for over 2,000 years. These microscopic hitchhikers provide future archaeologists with evidence that seawater indeed submerged this inland city. The wave completes what the earthquake started, turning your once thriving city into an inland sea that stretches across the plain. This isn't divine punishment for some forgotten sin against Poseidon. This is physics, geology, and hydrology, working together with ruthless efficiency to erase human civilization in a single night. The water that now covers your city creates something that will puzzle ancient writers for generations. Within months, Greek travelers passing through the area report seeing the tops of buildings beneath the water of a new lagoon. Ancient sources like Eratosthenes and Pausanias describe submerged ruins and a bronze statue visible in this poros. They describe roof tiles glinting in the sunlight and the occasional glimpse of painted walls through the clear water. But these ghostly reminders of your city don't last long. Within decades, even those traces disappear beneath an increasingly murky surface. The immediate aftermath creates an inland lagoon where your city once stood. Seawater mixed with debris from the destruction fills the depression created by the earthquake. Dead animals float among broken pottery and splintered wood. The water tastes of salt and something rotten, creating an ecosystem unlike anything that existed here before. Fish that normally live in the Gulf now swim through your former marketplace, while seabirds circle overhead looking for easy meals in the shallow water. Ancient writers describe this body of water as a poros, essentially a lake or lagoon where Helike once stood. They can't agree on whether it connects to the sea or stands alone. Some claim you can sail a boat from the Gulf directly to where the city used to be. Others insist it's completely separate. The confusion makes sense when you consider that the coastline itself shifted during the earthquake, making old geographical references useless. Over time, the Selinus River begins its slow work of reclaiming the land. Every spring flood carries tons of sediment downstream that settles in the still water of the lagoon, gradually filling the basin grain by grain. This process happens layer by layer, like the world's slowest hourglass filling up in reverse. What started as clear seawater gradually becomes a brown soup of river deposits. This sedimentation literally buries your city under meters of river mud, transforming an underwater ruin into dry land again. The process takes centuries, but it's relentless. The same geological forces that destroyed Helike now protect it, sealing the ruins beneath layers of sediment that act like a protective blanket. The lagoon shrinks year by year as the river fills it in, eventually becoming marsh, then solid ground. The lagoon theory explains why archaeologists eventually find Helike's remains inland rather than on the sea floor. Your city wasn't washed out to sea by the tsunami. It sank in place and stayed there, becoming a time capsule buried under river deposits. Ancient sources describe a bronze statue of Poseidon still visible underwater decades after the disaster, its hand reaching toward the surface in what looks like a plea for help. Sediment cores from the area reveal the story in layers that match what archaeologists expected. Older ground at the bottom, then marine deposits filled with tiny sea creatures that prove seawater covered the area, then river sediments on top. It's like reading a geological diary of your city's destruction and burial. The same forces that erased Helike from the surface world also ensured its preservation, creating the archaeological treasure that would remain hidden beneath the earth for over 2,000 years. The search for your lost city begins almost immediately after its destruction, but it takes modern technology to succeed where ancient memory fails. For over 2,000 years, Helike exists only in stories. Some scholars claim it's somewhere beneath the Gulf of Corinth, resting on the seafloor among fish and seaweed. Others insist it's pure legend, just another Greek tale that got better with each telling. Most people stopped caring altogether until 1988, when archaeologist Dora Katsonopoulou and physicist Stephen Sota decide to look inland instead of underwater. The Helike project begins when these two researchers abandoned the traditional search in the Gulf. Earlier underwater sonar searches and drilling found only muddy seafloor or prehistoric remains. Instead, they focus on the delta plain, where the lagoon theory suggests your city should be buried. This goes against decades of conventional wisdom that assumed the tsunami carried everything out to sea. But sometimes conventional wisdom is conventionally wrong. Early excavations reveal tantalizing clues scattered through the soil like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Pottery fragments turn up in boreholes, along with Roman buildings from later periods when people tried to rebuild on top of your buried city. But there's no definitive proof of classical Helike, just hints and possibilities that could belong to any ancient settlement in the region. Then, in the 1990s, magnetometer surveys detect what researchers report as unusually clear magnetic signatures, suggesting organized architecture lying beneath meters of sediment. The buried structures create distinct patterns in the magnetic field, like seeing the shadow of your city cast upward through dirt and time. The breakthrough finally comes in 2001, when excavations uncover the crucial evidence. Classical-era walls and pottery dated to the 4th century BC, and marine ostracods embedded in the destruction layers, proving seawater inundation. Among the rubble, archaeologists find a silver coin depicting Apollo and a dove. These tiny sea creatures provide the smoking gun, proof that this inland site was indeed submerged by seawater during the disaster. Your city's rediscovery reveals much more than just classical Helike. The archaeological layers span from the Bronze Age through Roman times, showing continuous occupation interrupted by your catastrophic night in 373 BC. People lived here for over 1,000 years before the earthquake, and they tried to rebuild afterward despite the obvious risks. The archaeological evidence matches the ancient accounts with uncomfortable precision. A city destroyed by earthquake, submerged by seawater, then buried by river sediments over centuries. The geological story written in mud and marine fossils confirms what Greek historians recorded but couldn't fully explain. Modern science succeeds where ancient memory failed. Geology, archaeology, and physics combine to locate what mythology could only preserve in stories passed down through generations. Ground-penetrating radar reveals street layouts. Chemical analysis identifies destruction layers. Marine microfossils prove seawater inundation. The real Helike proves more fascinating than any legend. Your city didn't need fantasy when reality provided drama enough. But what does this ancient disaster teach us about the nature of catastrophe itself? Helike's destruction reveals a profound truth about catastrophe. The most devastating disasters often begin with the most ordinary moments. A gentle tremor while reaching for wine, dismissed as divine mischief rather than geological warning. You laughed off the earthquake because that's what humans do. We normalize danger until it's too late to run. Your city's fate shows how human civilization exists at the mercy of forces that operate on timescales we can barely understand. Tectonic plates build pressure for centuries, then release it in minutes. Helike spent 1,000 years thriving on top of a geological time bomb that finally went off during a festival night. Helike shows how ordinary living, a festival, a rumble, can sit astride long-term tectonic forces, and how the same process that destroyed the city preserved it for archaeologists. The irony is perfect. Some scholars have suggested Helike may have influenced later tales like Plato's Atlantis. Hollywood gets Atlantis. Helike got mud and a very patient archaeology project. One is pure fantasy. The other actually happened and got buried under river sediment for 2 millennia. What do you do when a fleet bringing perhaps tens of thousands of men shows up at your door with enough cannons to level a mountain? If you're the 6,100 defenders of Malta in 1565, apparently you poison the local wells with bitter herbs and dead animals before the landing and hope for the best. This is the story of how a tiny Mediterranean island became the hinge point between European survival and Ottoman domination. The siege that followed would cost many thousands of lives. Scholars put Ottoman losses in the thousands, with some contemporary sources giving figures in the mid-tens of thousands, while defender losses were far smaller but still heavy. It would level entire cities, and prove that sometimes the most important battles are won not through heroic charges, but by simply refusing to die. So, you find yourself standing inside a limestone fortress, about to discover what that refusal actually looks like. The limestone walls of your new accommodations rise around you like the inside of a quarry, and the Mediterranean sun has already turned this place into something resembling a bread oven. You're one of a few thousand defenders scattered across several cramped forts across Malta. The island's knights number about 500 total, and the whole defending force adds up to roughly 6,100. But many individual posts are tiny and overwhelmed. Some forts, like Street, Ernle, were built with small garrisons in mind. Historically, about 100 men, so crowded isn't just a feeling, it's a logistic reality. Your bed is a patch of stone floor with a blanket that smells like the last 3 guys who used it, none of whom believed in bathing. The wool has absorbed months of sweat, grime, and what you hope is just Mediterranean humidity. You discover that medieval fortress architects never heard of ventilation, so the air moves about as much as a dead fish. Every breath tastes like limestone dust mixed with the collective exhalation of several hundred men who consider washing a luxury. The flies arrive with the dawn and apparently signed a lease because they never leave. They buzz around the communal latrines that are, as you'd expect in a hastily arranged fort, rudimentary and positioned near the water. The designers probably thought this was practical engineering. The flies think it's an all-you-can-eat buffet with an ocean view. You realize the Ottoman fleet is visible from your window, close enough to count their sails, far enough that you can't do anything about it. The ships bob in the harbor like toys in a bathtub, except these toys carry cannons and several thousand soldiers who really want to meet you. Every morning brings the same routine. Wake up sticky with sweat, fight for water that tastes like limestone dust, and pretend the distant Turkish camps aren't getting bigger. The knights keep talking about honor and duty, but mostly they complain about the heat and argue over who gets the shadiest spot during afternoon drills. Sir Francesco discusses the glory of defending Christendom while simultaneously trying to claim the only patch of floor that gets a breeze. Honor is important, but shade is immediate. The Spanish soldiers mutter about Maltese hospitality, while the Italian mercenaries wonder why they didn't negotiate hazard pay for sleeping on rocks. You discover that fortress life isn't about glory. It's about finding ways to sleep when your roommate snores, the stone is hard, and enemy ships bob just offshore. The romantic notions about medieval warfare die faster than your appetite for the morning gruel. Nobody mentioned that defending civilization would involve so much standing around in the heat, wondering if that itch is a flea bite or just nervous sweating. The chronicles will talk about brave defenders holding the walls, but they won't mention that most of your time is spent figuring out how to get comfortable on limestone and trying not to breathe through your nose when the wind shifts. Your stomach starts making sounds that could be mistaken for distant thunder, and you begin to suspect that the real enemy might not be the one with the cannons. The real battle begins at mealtime, when you discover what passes for cuisine when you're trapped in a limestone box with a few thousand other people who can't leave. The Grand Master had ordered early harvests and stockpiles, but supplies were still tight once siege conditions set in, and both sides lived on hardtack, salted meat, and whatever could be rationed. Your gourmet options include hardtack biscuits that could double as building materials, and salt pork that's been salted since roughly the Crusades. The hardtack arrives in chunks that make suspicious clicking sounds when you tap them against the wall. These biscuits were designed to last through long sea voyages, which apparently means they can survive anything except human teeth. The water tastes like it was filtered through a sock, which it might have been, considering the knights weren't particularly picky about filtration methods. The wine is so watered down it's basically purple water with delusions of grandeur. You get excited when you see liquid that isn't completely clear, only to discover it's been diluted to the point where you'd get more alcohol from licking the communion chalice. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner blur into the same grey porridge made from whatever grain survived the pre-siege rush to strip the island bare. The cook takes whatever flour hasn't been completely consumed by insects, adds water that hopefully came from a clean cistern, and creates a substance that has the consistency of wet mortar and roughly the same nutritional value. You learn to eat it quickly before your brain has time to process the texture. You watch grown men argue over who gets the piece of hardtack with fewer weevils, as if there's actually a winning choice in that scenario. The veterans explain that the weevils are protein, but you notice they still pick them out when they think nobody's looking. Sir Antonio claims the darker spots are just moisture stains, while everyone else knows they're probably something much worse. The Mediterranean heat makes everything spoil faster, so your already questionable meals come with the added excitement of wondering if that smell is the food or just Fort Street Elmo's natural ambiance. The porous limestone walls don't exactly help with preservation. You find yourself sniffing everything twice, trying to determine if that particular odor is coming from your dinner, your neighbor's dinner, or the general fortress atmosphere that's been marinating in human sweat for weeks. The Ottomans had large stores and supply lines from North Africa and Tunisia, while defenders had to ration, and contemporary sources record the defenders' food as meager and repetitive. You can see their cooking fires from the walls, and the smoke carries the scent of actual food being prepared by people who aren't trying to make a meal stretch for 3 days. Meanwhile, you're learning to appreciate any piece of salt pork that doesn't require chiseling. Your stomach starts making sounds that could be mistaken for enemy artillery. The hunger creates its own rhythm inside the fortress walls, a constant background growling that harmonizes with everyone else's digestive protests. You begin to understand why the defenders poisoned all the wells and harvested crops early before the siege began. Denying the enemy local food was part of the defensive strategy, even if it meant everyone would share the misery. You realize that heroic last stands are a lot less heroic when they're powered by rancid pork and biscuits that require a hammer to break apart. The enemy hasn't even started shooting yet, and you're already being defeated by your own dinner. But as your stomach settles into its unhappy routine, you notice something else competing for your attention. Sounds drifting over the walls from the Ottoman camps that suggest your food problems might soon seem trivial. Those distant sounds transform from background noise into a methodical countdown to your destruction. Every morning brings new sounds from the Turkish camps. The creak of wagon wheels echoes across the harbour as supply trains arrive from Constantinople. Engineers shout instructions in Turkish, while workers hammer with the rhythmic patience of people who know they have all the time in the world. You're stuck listening to every nail being hammered, every beam being positioned, every stone being dragged into place. The Ottomans are building their siege works with methodical precision. They don't rush because they don't need to. Time is their ally, and they use it like a weapon. The Ottomans emplaced many batteries on heights such as Santa Margherita and Sybaris, concentrating dozens of siege guns. Later accounts estimate the attackers ringed Birgu and Senglia with some 65 siege guns. You can hear the scrape of metal against stone as they position their artillery. Each cannon makes a grinding sound when they drag it forward. Metal wheels against limestone that sets your teeth on edge and reminds you that those guns will soon be pointed directly at your head. The sound carries perfectly across the water, a constant reminder that the Ottoman war machine is assembling itself piece by piece. The worst part isn't the noise itself, it's the pauses. Everything goes quiet for a few minutes, and you wonder if they're finally ready to start the real show. Your brain fills those silent moments with imagination, picturing Turkish gunners loading their cannons or engineers making final adjustments to their siege towers. The silence becomes more oppressive than the hammering, because it means they might be done preparing. The sounds get closer and more organized each day. What started as random construction noise transforms into the purposeful rhythm of a war machine getting ready. You can distinguish between different activities now. That's the sound of timber being sawed for siege ladders. Those voices are discussing artillery trajectories. That grinding noise means another cannon just moved 10 feet closer to your walls. The Ottoman camps have become a massive workshop dedicated to finding creative ways to kill you. Your fellow defenders try to joke about it. Someone makes a comment about Turkish work ethic, or suggests they should charge the Ottomans rent for using Maltese stone. But everyone jumps when a Turkish hammer hits metal just a little too loud, just a little too close. The jokes get weaker as the sounds get more organized. Nobody laughs when you hear preparations for artillery that will use chain shot and other anti-personnel rounds. Sleep becomes impossible because your brain keeps cataloguing every sound. Is that a cannon being moved, or just someone dropping firewood? That rhythmic pounding could be workers building siege towers, or it might be engineers testing the range of their artillery. Your mind turns every noise into a threat, every pause into a countdown. The darkness makes it worse because you can only hear the preparation, not see it. Sound travels perfectly across the water, carrying every detail of your approaching doom. The Ottoman engineers have turned their siege preparations into psychological warfare. They know you can hear every hammer blow, every shouted order, every cannon wheel grinding against stone. They're not just building siege works, they're building dread. Each sound reminds you that thousands of professionals are working around the clock to breach your walls and kill everyone inside them. You discover that waiting for a battle is worse than fighting one. In combat, you're too busy to think about all the ways you might die. But sitting in Fort Street, Elmo, listening to the Ottomans methodically prepare your destruction, gives you plenty of time to consider the possibilities. The sounds of inevitable, methodical preparation have become their most effective weapon, and they haven't fired a single shot yet. Which makes you wonder what brilliant tactical genius is supposed to get you through this mess. The leadership situation becomes clear once you meet the people supposedly in charge of keeping everyone alive. Grand Master Jean Perisseau de Valette gives inspiring speeches about duty and honor while standing on the fortress walls, gesturing toward the Ottoman fleet with dramatic flourishes. His voice carries across the courtyard as he talks about defending Christendom and the sacred duty of the Knights Hospitaller. La Valette projects calm and pulls people together, but the siege exposes the limits of every leader's options. Even the most capable commander can't conjure reinforcements from thin air or make limestone walls impervious to cannon fire. The command confusion isn't limited to the Christian side. The Ottoman command was split. Mustafa led the land force, Piali the fleet, and Dragut's later arrival complicated an already divided leadership. You can see the results of their disagreements from the walls. Ottoman forces change positions, redirect their siege works, and sometimes seem to be working at cross purposes. The friction between land and sea commanders creates opportunities for defenders, but it also means you're facing an enemy that's unpredictable because they can't agree among themselves. Your immediate commander can't decide whether to reinforce the walls or save materials for repairs after the bombardment starts. He orders workers to strengthen the eastern wall, then changes his mind and tells them to stockpile limestone blocks for emergency patches. By afternoon, he's back to reinforcement duty, so the workers do a little of both and accomplish neither particularly well. The result is walls that are sort of stronger and a stockpile that's sort of adequate for repairs, which is exactly the kind of military precision that inspires confidence. Tension builds as you realize the grand strategy seems to be stand here and try not to die, which isn't exactly the brilliant military planning you were hoping for. The officers hold meetings where they argue about things like whether to fight on the walls or fall back to inner defenses, as if the Ottomans care about your tactical preferences. Sir Francesco advocates for aggressive sorties to disrupt enemy siege works, while Commander Antonio argues for conservative defense until the relief force arrives. They debate this for hours while Turkish engineers continue building artillery positions outside. You watch seasoned veterans admit they've never faced anything like this Ottoman war machine. These are knights who fought at sea battles across the Mediterranean, mercenaries who survived campaigns in Italy, and soldiers who defended Spanish fortresses against French artillery. Their uncertainty becomes as contagious as the dysentery spreading through the cramped quarters. When men who've spent decades in warfare start admitting they're not sure what comes next, it doesn't exactly boost morale among the regular defenders. Messages arrive from other parts of Malta with conflicting information. Estimates of Ottoman strength varied. Some letters put it at 22,000, others much higher. The morning dispatch might say, Fort Street. Angelo is holding strong, while the afternoon message warns that Turkish sappers are already digging under the walls. You learn to read between the lines, which usually means assuming the worst-case scenario and hoping you're wrong. The most honest conversation happens when you overhear Commander Pietro talking to his sergeants after the evening briefing. He admits that survival depends less on strategy and more on being too stubborn to quit. There's no secret plan, no brilliant tactical maneuver that will save everyone. Just the hope that enough defenders will keep showing up on the walls each morning to make the Ottomans pay for every foot of progress. The Turkish cannons are finally rolling into position, and you're about to discover what all this preparation has been leading toward. The bombardment that follows will teach you that history's greatest battles are won not by heroes charging into glory, but by ordinary people who wake up each day and choose to endure another round of flies, bad food, and creeping dread. You've discovered more about courage in these cramped limestone quarters than any romantic chronicle could teach you. Fort Street Elmo will eventually fall after weeks of bombardment, but the cost proves devastating. Historically, the cost of Street Elmo was severe. Contemporary accounts put Ottoman losses there at perhaps 6,000, and the time it bought was strategically decisive. The Ottomans lose precious weeks they can't afford, and half their elite janissaries in the process. That victory helped precipitate funds and construction that led to the building of Valletta on Sybaris the next year. But right now, all you know is that courage looks a lot like standing in the Mediterranean heat, swatting insects, and refusing to give up when your commanders are improvising and your dinner fights back. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up tomorrow, even when tomorrow promises nothing but more limestone walls, more terrible meals, and more sounds of enemy cannons being wheeled into position. Picture this. You're standing in the desert of Sudan, surrounded by about 255 ancient pyramids stretching to the horizon. Now, picture opening any history textbook and finding exactly 0 mentions of them. This is one of archaeology's quieter embarrassments. While Egypt's 118 pyramids get documentaries, museum exhibitions, and tourist crowds, Sudan's pyramids draw far fewer visitors than Egypt's sites. Sudan's tourism has been severely depressed in recent years, leaving Meroe largely crowd-free. They built more pyramids than Egypt and even ruled it. Yet most textbooks ignore them completely. Ask most people to name 3 Egyptian pharaohs and they'll give you Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, and maybe Ramesses II. Now ask them to name a single Kushite ruler. You'll get blank stares. This is remarkable considering Kushite pharaohs actually conquered Egypt and ruled it for nearly a century. King Taharqa commanded armies from Nubia and built monuments that survive at Nuri and in Egypt, appearing in the Bible as a major power player. Still, Taharqa and other Kushite rulers are far less visible in standard school curricula than Egyptian pharaohs. The Kingdom of Kush managed to be more prolific pyramid builders than Egypt, while remaining invisible in popular culture. This civilization built more pyramids than Egypt, yet they get only a fraction of the attention Egypt's monuments attract. The numbers don't add up, and neither does the historical narrative we've been fed. Kushite pharaohs like Taharqa ruled territories stretching across 2 modern countries. They commanded Egyptian armies, built monuments from Khartoum to Cairo, and maintained diplomatic relations with Assyria and other Mediterranean powers. These weren't regional chieftains playing dress-up with Egyptian culture. They were legitimate pharaohs who controlled one of the ancient world's most powerful empires. Yet most people couldn't pick Taharqa out of a lineup if their life depended on it. The Kingdom of Kush evolved through 3 distinct phases, each leaving behind architectural evidence that puts many contemporary civilizations to shame. Kerma, from 2500 to 1500 BCE, Napata from 1000 to 300 BCE, and Meroe from 300 BCE to 350 CE. The Kerma period established early Nubian power with massive fortified cities. The Napatan period saw Kushite rulers conquer Egypt and establish the 25th dynasty. The Meroitic period created an independent kingdom that outlasted Roman Egypt by centuries. Each phase produced royal burial grounds filled with pyramids, temples, and treasure that rivals anything found in Egyptian tombs. These African rulers accumulated staggering wealth through gold mines that supplied the ancient Mediterranean world. Nubian gold financed construction projects across hundreds of miles of desert. Trade routes brought ivory, ebony, and exotic animals from deep Africa through Kushite territory to Egyptian and Mediterranean markets. The kingdom controlled the economic pipeline between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world for over 1,000 years. The Kushites didn't just copy Egyptian culture, they adapted and transformed it, creating pyramid-building traditions that continued roughly from the 7th century BCE to about the mid-4th century CE, around 700 BCE to 350 CE. While Egyptian pyramid construction had essentially stopped by the time the Kushites started building, Nubian rulers kept the tradition alive for over a millennium. They built pyramid complexes at Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe that showcased distinctly African architectural innovations. The geographic scope of Kushite influence stretched from modern-day Khartoum to southern Egypt, with pyramid sites scattered across hundreds of miles of Nile Valley desert. This wasn't some minor regional power operating in Egypt's shadow. The Kingdom of Kush was a major ancient superpower that controlled vast territories, commanded enormous wealth, and built monuments that would outlast empires. So, how exactly did they build these monuments? The answer reveals architectural choices that would baffle early European explorers. Kushite architects developed a fundamentally different approach to pyramid construction that confused European explorers for decades. While Egyptian pyramids contain burial chambers inside the structure itself, Nubian pyramids sit on top of underground burial chambers like elaborate tombstones. The actual tomb lies beneath the pyramid, not within it. This wasn't architectural incompetence. It was a deliberate design choice that early European archaeologists completely misunderstood, leading to decades of confused excavations. These treasure hunters expected Egyptian-style internal chambers and spent years demolishing pyramid structures from the inside out, looking for rooms that simply didn't exist. They were digging in the wrong direction entirely. Archaeologists later found the tombs were below the pyramids, not inside them, a discovery that corrected early confusion. The visual difference is striking. Nubian pyramids are narrower and steeper, often inclined around 70 degrees, standing roughly 6 to 30 meters high, with much smaller footprints than the broad 40 to 50 degrees Egyptian monuments. Egyptian pyramids appear wide and imposing. Kushite pyramids appear narrow and elegant. The two styles are immediately recognizable once you know what to look for. Building these monuments required workers to haul massive stone blocks across desert terrain in punishing desert conditions. The construction sites were located in areas so remote and harsh that unprepared travelers could die from heat exposure before reaching them. Yet work crews managed to transport, cut, and position precisely fitted stones in conditions that challenge modern construction equipment. The real architectural achievement lies underground. Burial chambers carved deep beneath the pyramids contain granite sarcophagi weighing up to 15 tons. Some granite sarcophagi, like Aspelta's, weighed around 15.5 tons, requiring careful lowering into subterranean chambers. Moving these massive stone coffins into position required engineering solutions that rival any Egyptian achievement. Workers had to lower multi-ton objects down narrow shafts, then maneuver them through underground corridors barely wide enough to accommodate them. Pyramid temple complexes functioned as complete religious installations. Tomb chapels often show painted scenes of the deceased, and offering chapels abut many pyramids. Features that underline how these structures were active religious sites, not mere markers. These weren't just tombs. They were active religious centers, where ceremonies continued for decades after burial, maintained by dedicated staff funded through royal endowments. The sophisticated interior decorations tell individual stories. Plastered walls display scenes from the deceased's life, military victories, religious ceremonies, and family relationships. Each tomb became a personalized monument rather than a standardized burial container. Egyptian tombs often follow similar decorative patterns. Kushite tombs reflect unique biographical details specific to each ruler. The chambers contain painted reliefs showing Kushite pharaohs wearing distinctive royal regalia, different from Egyptian crowns and symbols. Wall paintings depict African animals, tropical plants, and cultural practices specific to Nubian society. These decorations provide detailed information about daily life, religious beliefs, and political structures that written records don't preserve. Nubian pyramids represented a completely different approach to monumental architecture. They prioritized height and individual expression over the massive, uniform structures Egypt preferred. Each pyramid complex functioned as a personalized memorial combining religious temple, royal tomb, and biographical monument. Unfortunately, European treasure hunters completely missed these architectural subtleties in their rush to find gold. In 1834, Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Fellini looked at dozens of ancient pyramids and decided systematic demolition was his preferred excavation technique. This wasn't archaeological science, this was treasure hunting with industrial efficiency. European expeditions treated Nubian sites like Egyptian treasure chests, expecting to find gold-filled burial chambers inside pyramid structures. They arrived with tools, workers, and absolute confidence that Kushite builders followed Egyptian construction methods. They were completely wrong on every count. These treasure hunters operated under assumptions about Nubian burial practices that led them to destroy the very monuments they were trying to explore. They expected internal chambers like Egyptian pyramids. They found solid stone construction. So, they decided to dismantle their way through until they found something valuable. Fellini systematically demolished pyramids from the top down, using demolition rather than careful excavation. He's credited with destroying over 40 pyramids at Meroe, including Pyramid N6. He literally dismantled entire structures stone by stone from the apex downward, creating controlled demolitions that would impress modern construction crews. His workers hauled away thousands of precisely cut blocks, turning architectural masterpieces into rubble piles. The pyramids disappeared layer by layer over several months. Then Fellini discovered Queen Amenishaketo's treasure. Dozens of gold and silver jewelry pieces, ornate rings, necklaces, and ceremonial objects emerged from the debris. The find validated his destructive methods in his own mind and convinced him that demolishing pyramids was legitimate archaeological technique. Some finds were sold to European museums. Parts went to Munich and to the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. This success encouraged more destructive expeditions. European teams raced to demolish pyramids before competitors could claim the sites. Multiple expeditions operated simultaneously, creating a treasure-hunting free-for-all that treated ancient monuments like mining claims. The desert became a demolition zone where teams competed to destroy structures fastest. Some looters did find valuables, but many scientific answers lay in the subterranean chambers that demolition and hasty methods obscured or destroyed. The burial chambers sat beneath the pyramids, accessible through conventional excavation. Fellini and his competitors were destroying the monuments to reach contexts that careful archaeology could have preserved. Harvard's George Reisner faced different challenges in the 1910s. Rising groundwater flooded burial chambers, creating dangerous working conditions. Reisner mapped more than 80 royal burials at Newry but recorded dangerous conditions. A staircase collapse killed 5 workers during his excavations. Underground chambers filled with water overnight. Structural collapses trapped workers. His team later abandoned some work for safety reasons. 19th century treasure hunting and demolition destroyed dozens of pyramids. Fellini alone has been blamed for the loss of over 40, removing archaeological context that modern scholars now regret. They demolished architectural achievements that had survived desert storms, political upheavals, and centuries of neglect. These expeditions missed the archaeological significance of what they were destroying, treating sophisticated monuments like obstacles to overcome rather than achievements to preserve. These colonial attitudes shaped which ancient civilizations received scholarly attention and museum funding for decades afterward. The damage extended far beyond individual monuments. European research priorities created systematic patterns that still shape how we understand ancient Africa. Open any world history textbook and count the pages dedicated to ancient Egypt versus ancient Nubia. You'll find a ratio that statisticians would find professionally offensive. Egypt gets entire chapters. Nubia gets footnotes. Colonial-era assumptions and institutional priorities produced persistent bias. Early scholars often explain Nubian achievement as derivative of Egyptian models rather than as independent innovation. European researchers approached Africa with preconceived notions about who could build monuments and who couldn't. They assumed advanced architecture must have originated from Mediterranean civilizations, then spread southward to less capable societies. Early Egyptologists framed Nubian achievements as derivative copies of superior Egyptian culture, ignoring evidence of indigenous innovation and adaptation. When Kushite pyramids displayed different architectural features, scholars dismissed them as inferior imitations rather than distinct innovations. When Nubian burial practices differed from Egyptian methods, researchers labeled them primitive rather than alternative. Practical factors reinforced these academic preferences. European scholars could reach Egyptian sites via Mediterranean steamships and rail. Sudan's pyramid fields were remote, often requiring long desert travel and politically risky passages, a practical barrier that shifted research focus. Museum acquisition policies favored Egyptian artifacts over Nubian ones, creating funding cycles that reinforced research bias toward already well-studied civilizations. Loot from Meroe ended up in European museums, some pieces in Munich and Berlin, reinforcing the visible Egyptian collections that shaped public education and scholarship. The academic establishment built entire careers around Egyptian specialization. Scholars published papers, received grants, and earned tenure through Egyptian research. Switching to understudied Nubian topics meant abandoning established professional networks and funding sources. Educational curricula developed around existing museum collections and established research, creating self-perpetuating cycles that featured artifacts from popular collections rather than comprehensive historical representation. Modern Sudanese scholars are working to reclaim their heritage narrative, emphasizing Kushite achievements as central to national identity rather than footnotes to Egyptian history. Current projects including National Geographic documentation, drone missions, the Qatari mission for the pyramids of Sudan, and German-Sudanese collaborations are now systematically documenting and conserving these sites. These scholars face uphill battles against entrenched institutional preferences. Changing textbooks requires convincing publishers that Nubian content will sell. Securing research funding requires demonstrating academic interest that doesn't yet exist. The invisibility of Nubian pyramids results from decades of institutional bias that prioritized familiar narratives over comprehensive historical accuracy, creating blind spots that persist in modern education. But institutional bias isn't the only threat these monuments face. The same environmental forces that challenged early archaeologists are intensifying, creating new urgency around preservation efforts. Rising groundwater has long impeded tomb exploration. George Reisner noted flooding during his 1910s excavations, and in 2020 Meroe's pyramids were threatened by floods, creating new urgency for conservation. Chambers that stayed dry for millennia now fill with muddy water within hours of being opened. Modern conservation challenges facing Nubian pyramids read like a complex logistical puzzle. Climate change accelerates groundwater rise. Political instability prevents long-term planning. Simple neglect allows structural damage that costs millions to repair. International sanctions limit funding options. Local communities lack resources to maintain world-class monuments sitting in their backyards. These monuments survived ancient wars between Kush and Rome. They weathered medieval neglect when Islamic rulers ignored pre-Islamic sites. They endured colonial treasure hunting that demolished dozens of structures. Now they face their greatest threat from 21st century environmental changes that previous civilizations never imagined. Underwater dives and remote-controlled submersibles have recently explored flooded chambers. Laser scanning and digital recording are helping conservation teams document fragile surfaces before water and salt destroy them. The Qatari mission and several international collaborations now work with Sudanese authorities on preservation. Camera equipment documents wall paintings before rising water destroys them permanently. Sonar mapping creates detailed chamber layouts without risking lives underground. Current preservation efforts involve international teams working with Sudanese institutions to document, protect, and sustainably manage these sites. German archaeologists use laser scanning to create precise digital records. British conservators develop new techniques for stabilizing water-damaged stonework. American universities fund graduate programs that train Sudanese archaeologists in modern preservation methods. Political instability and limited tourism infrastructure make conservation funding extremely difficult. Unlike Egypt, Sudan's tourism industry was crippled by decades of conflict and sanctions, so the reliable revenue streams that support Egyptian site conservation are largely absent, meaning preservation must rely on limited budgets and international partnerships. These world-class monuments survive on minimal protection budgets that wouldn't cover basic maintenance at popular tourist sites. Rising groundwater levels, intensified by climate change, accelerate structural damage to pyramids that weathered millennia of desert conditions. Stone foundations designed for arid environments crack when exposed to constant moisture. Salt deposits from evaporating groundwater eat away at carved surfaces. Underground chambers that preserved artifacts perfectly now become destruction zones. There is a race against rising water and limited funding, but international teams are creating digital records and local training programs to slow the damage. Small group tours generate revenue while limiting environmental impact. Local guide training creates employment opportunities. Community-based tourism models ensure that conservation benefits reach people living near these monuments. Modern technology offers unprecedented opportunities to study and preserve Nubian pyramids, but only if conservation efforts can outpace environmental degradation and political challenges. Digital archives preserve information even if physical monuments don't survive. Remote sensing reveals hidden structures without destructive excavation. If these sites disappear, we lose direct evidence about an African civilization that rivaled its better-known northern neighbor. The stakes extend far beyond individual monuments. What we're really confronting is a much larger question about historical knowledge itself. These monuments force us to reconsider how historical narratives get constructed and which civilizations earn our attention. Sudan's 255 pyramids represent not just an archaeological oversight, but a fundamental gap in how we understand ancient African achievement and global civilization. The Kingdom of Kush built more monuments, ruled longer, and controlled more territory than most civilizations that fill entire textbook chapters. Yet, they remain invisible. This raises uncomfortable questions about what other major civilizations might be hiding in plain sight, overlooked by educational systems that prioritize familiar narratives over comprehensive history. How many African empires, Asian kingdoms, or American civilizations have we simply ignored because they don't fit established academic frameworks? Remember, roughly 255 Nubian pyramids were built across sites such as El Kuru, Nuri, Jebel Barkal, and Meroe, often with subterranean tombs and richly decorated chapels. Their invisibility tells us more about modern biases and institutional focus than about the Kushites' abilities. It's odd, a desert full of monuments that rarely get more than a passing mention in class notes, and yet they speak loudly if we only listen.